Why did Hudson, a gentleman, hate Dean so much? The two men, the two legends, Rock Hudson and James Dean, were the brightest stars in Hollywood, captivating audiences with their talent and beauty. But behind the lens of giant, admiration turned to hostility, and respect gave way to spite. Their feud became one of Hollywood's darkest secrets, a rivalry born of ego, jealousy, and hidden truths that no one could escape. Rock Hudson, the man who would one day become Hollywood's ultimate leading man, began life far from the glitter of movie premieres. He was born Roy Harold Scher Jr. on November 17, 1925, in Winnetka, Illinois, a small town outside Chicago. His story opened not with privilege or promise, but with abandonment, hardship, and the kind of loneliness that leaves lasting marks. When Roy was still a boy, his father walked out and never returned. His mother, left alone during the dark years of the Great Depression, struggled to provide food, shelter, and stability. She eventually remarried, hoping to bring security into the household. Instead, the new stepfather carried only sternness, coldness, and criticism. Home was never a refuge. It was a place of tension, where affection was scarce and where silence replaced warmth. In that house, young Roy learned to endure. He kept his head down, hid his feelings, and forced himself to grow up faster than any child should. Childhood was not innocence, but training in survival. He built an inner shield that would protect him later in life, but it also left him with scars of longing and emptiness. School offered him moments of escape, but they were short-lived. After high school, the realities of survival pulled him straight into the working world. He became a mechanic, his hands stained with grease and oil after long days in the shop. Later, he worked as a truck driver, hauling heavy loads across the endless roads of the American Midwest. These were honest jobs, but they were exhausting and unfulfilling. Each night he returned home bone-tired, yet restless inside, whispering to himself that surely life had to hold something more. And yet, even as he labored in obscurity, there was one thing that set him apart: his presence. Roy stood an astonishing 6 feet 4 inches tall. His frame was broad, his shoulders strong, and his face striking in a way that seemed almost unreal. His deep eyes suggested stories untold. His rare smile carried a warmth that lingered in memory. Even in work clothes covered in sweat and grit, he turned heads wherever he went. It was the kind of look that belonged not to the shop floor, but to the movie screen. Friends noticed the way strangers stopped and stared. They whispered that Roy was meant for something greater than mechanics or trucking, that destiny had placed him in the wrong setting. And in quiet moments, Roy dared to believe them. Still, Hollywood felt impossibly far away. He had never acted, never stood before a camera, never thought of himself as an entertainer. He was shy, awkward in crowds, and painfully aware of his lack of training. Yet, the way people looked at him planted a seed. Perhaps, if fate allowed, he could step into that shimmering world of lights and legends. The truth is that Roy's difficult childhood had already prepared him for such a leap. The absence of a father had made him independent. The severity of a stepfather had given him discipline. Years of physical labor had built endurance. These were invisible tools that would one day carry him through rejection and disappointment. Because rejection did come. When he first tried screen tests, Roy was awkward, stiff, and unsure of himself. He forgot lines. He froze before the camera. Casting directors dismissed him as another handsome face without skill. But unlike others, he did not give up. Life had already trained him to take blows and keep moving forward. That persistence, paired with his extraordinary looks, finally drew the attention of Universal Pictures. The studio saw not a polished star, but raw material, a diamond in the rough they could shape and market. They began the process of transformation, teaching him how to speak, how to move, how to act, and they gave him a new name, one that carried strength and permanence: Rock Hudson. So before the legend, before the fame, there was simply Roy Harold Scherer Jr., a boy abandoned by his father, hardened by labor, and haunted by silence. He carried within him both the wounds of a fractured childhood and the stubborn hope that his life could become something greater than the shadows of where it began. That hope, fragile yet unyielding, was the first step toward the destiny that would one day make him unforgettable. By the late 1940s, the boy once known as Roy Harold Scherer Jr. was no more. In his place stood Rock Hudson, a name chosen by Universal Pictures to sound powerful, timeless, and impossible to forget. The studio saw in him a diamond in the rough, tall, breathtakingly handsome, and with the kind of presence that could sell tickets before he ever opened his mouth. But Hudson's journey into Hollywood was not immediate glory. It began with failure, insecurity, and relentless training. When he first faced the camera, Hudson struggled. He fumbled lines, stiffened under the lights, and often seemed more like a model posing than an actor performing. Critics behind the scenes whispered that he was just another pretty face, destined to fade as quickly as he appeared. Universal, however, refused to let him vanish. They placed him in an intensive program, teaching him how to control his voice, refine his posture, and carry himself with elegance. Day after day, he repeated lines, learned gestures, and practiced his walk until it looked natural. Slowly, the awkward young man began to transform into someone audiences could believe in. Universal invested heavily in his image. Publicists crafted stories of charm and wholesomeness. Photographers captured him at angles that emphasized his height, his jawline, and that unforgettable smile. The studio machine was ruthless, but it knew how to manufacture stars, and Hudson was its perfect project. He became the kind of man who looked as though he had stepped out of a dream. A figure who represented the post-war fantasy of strength, romance, and stability. By the early 1950s, Hudson's career began to take shape. His early roles were modest, but his presence on screen was undeniable. Audiences leaned in when he appeared, drawn not only to his looks but to the growing confidence in his performance. Then came the breakthrough, Magnificent Obsession in 1954. Playing a reckless man who redeems himself through love and sacrifice, Hudson struck a chord with audiences. The film was a box office hit, and suddenly Rock Hudson was no longer just a studio creation, he was a leading man. That success carried him into All That Heaven Allows in 1955, a film that paired him again with Jane Wyman. The story of forbidden love between a wealthy widow and her younger gardener became a cultural phenomenon. Critics praised Hudson's depth, noting that he was no longer stiff or uncertain, but commanding, sensitive, and believable. He was not simply beautiful, he was compelling. With these films, Hudson cemented himself as one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. But it was Giant in 1956 that turned him into a legend. Starring alongside Elizabeth Taylor and the fiery young James Dean, Hudson faced perhaps his greatest challenge yet. He played Bick Benedict, a wealthy Texas rancher whose life unfolds across decades. The role demanded subtlety, range, and emotional weight. For Hudson, it was a chance to prove once and for all that he was more than a matinee idol, and he delivered. His performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, placing him in the highest echelon of Hollywood talent. Yet Giant was not just a triumph of performance, it was a crucible of personality. On set, Hudson clashed with James Dean, whose rebellious style and disregard for Hollywood tradition irritated him deeply. Dean thought Hudson was a polished product of the studio system, a man who lacked the raw artistry of method acting. Hudson, in turn, saw Dean as childish, selfish, and disrespectful. Elizabeth Taylor adored Dean, and that only sharpened Hudson's resentment. This tension, brewing behind the scenes, would become a defining rivalry in his life, one that Hudson himself admitted turned into deep, personal hatred. Despite the conflict, the film was a massive success. Giant became an instant classic, and Hudson emerged not just as a star, but as an emblem of American cinema. He was now the face of the romantic leading man, the figure women adored and men admired. He embodied the fantasy of the strong yet sensitive hero, a man who seemed both untouchable and achingly human. Through the 1950s, Hudson's reputation soared. He appeared on magazine covers, his photographs pinned to bedroom walls, his name whispered in theaters as audiences swooned. He became the archetype of the Hollywood dream, a man who seemed to have it all: fame, beauty, and talent. To the world, he was flawless, the perfect gentleman. But beneath the surface, the seeds of conflict with James Dean had already been sown. Hudson's rise to glory was not without shadows, and the resentment he carried toward Dean would remain a wound that never healed. Still, in the golden decade of the 1950s, Rock Hudson stood tall as one of the most admired actors in Hollywood history. Proof that even a boy from Winnetka, Illinois, could be reborn as an immortal screen icon. By the dawn of the 1960s, Rock Hudson was more than a rising star. He was Hollywood royalty. He had conquered drama with magnificent obsession, dazzled audiences with All That Heaven Allows, and proven his artistry with Giant. But now, a new chapter was unfolding, one that would define him for a generation. It was the era of romantic comedies, and Rock Hudson, paired with the sparkling Doris Day, would become the undisputed king of the genre. In 1959, Hudson and Day lit up the screen in Pillow Talk. The chemistry between the two was electric. Hudson, tall, elegant, and effortlessly charming, played the perfect foil to Day's witty, independent heroine. The film was a smash hit, earning critical praise and commercial success, even securing an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. More importantly, it reinvented Hudson. No longer just the brooding leading man of melodramas, he now proved he could be funny, lighthearted, and irresistibly playful. The success of Pillow Talk led to more. In 1961, the duo reunited for Lover Come Back, a clever romantic romp that cemented them as America's favorite on-screen couple. By 1964, they completed their trilogy with Send Me No Flowers, a comedy of mistaken identities and suburban satire. Each film was a box office triumph, each performance reaffirming Hudson's status as a versatile star. Audiences adored him, not only as a symbol of masculinity, but as a man who could laugh at himself, flirt without arrogance, and embody the fantasy of the perfect gentleman. Beyond these collaborations, Hudson remained a dominant force at the box office. His name alone could sell a film. Studios lined up projects that showcased his range, from war epics to westerns to light comedies. His face appeared on magazine covers, his image pinned to bedroom walls, his style imitated by men who saw him as the definition of suave. Rock Hudson had become more than an actor, he was a cultural icon. But Hollywood is fickle, and times were changing. By the late 1960s, the old studio system that had built Hudson was crumbling. Audiences wanted something edgier, rawer, more rebellious. New stars like Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, and later Al Pacino emerged with a style that felt grittier and more modern. For Hudson, whose persona had been carefully polished into elegance, the shift was dangerous. He was still admired, still loved, but he risked becoming a relic of an earlier era. Rather than fade, Hudson adapted. In the early 1970s, he moved into television, starring in the crime drama Macmillan and Wife. Playing Commissioner Stuart McMillan, he brought authority, charm, and humor to the role. The series became a hit, running for 6 seasons and earning Hudson a Golden Globe Award. Once again, he proved his resilience, finding a way to remain relevant even as Hollywood transformed around him. To the public, Rock Hudson's image was flawless. He was the ultimate leading man. Tall, handsome, sophisticated, the kind of man every woman dreamed of and every man wanted to emulate. He walked red carpets with ease, spoke to reporters with grace, and seemed to live the perfect Hollywood life. In photographs, he was always immaculate. Tailored suits, broad smiles, and eyes that sparkled with mystery. But behind that polished image lay a secret Hudson carried with constant fear. He was a gay man in an industry that had no room for honesty. In the conservative climate of mid-century America, being openly homosexual could end a career overnight. Studios knew it, agents knew it, and Hudson himself knew it. For this reason, his public life was carefully managed. Dates with glamorous actresses were arranged. Tabloids were fed stories that reinforced his masculine image. On screen, he kissed leading ladies. Off-screen, he fought to keep his truth hidden. This dual existence weighed heavily on him. Every laugh, every smile for the cameras was shadowed by the fear of exposure. He lived with the knowledge that one rumor, one photograph, one slip could shatter everything he had built. His friends described him as warm and kind, but also guarded, always aware of who was watching. Even at the height of his fame, Hudson carried within him the quiet loneliness of a man who could never fully be himself. It was this tension between the public Rock Hudson and the private Roy Scherer that gave his performances an unspoken depth. Audiences saw the charm, the elegance, the masculinity. What they didn't see was the cost of maintaining the illusion. In many ways, Hudson's greatest role was not in Pillow Talk or Giant, but in the life he performed every day, the role of the perfect Hollywood man. And yet, for all the secrecy and fear, Rock Hudson endured. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, he remained one of the most beloved actors in America. His star power never fully dimmed, his presence never faded from the public imagination. He had become not just a movie star, but a symbol of an era of glamour, of carefully managed images, and of dreams spun larger than life. Behind the glamour of Rock Hudson's public persona was a private life that was far more complicated, fragile, and lonely. To his millions of fans, he was the perfect man, tall, handsome, and masculine, the embodiment of mid-century Hollywood fantasy. But away from the cameras, Hudson carried a secret he could never share, a truth that shaped his relationships, haunted his nights, and influenced his every choice. He was a gay man in an era when admitting it could ruin not just his career, but his life. Hollywood in the 1950s was glamorous, but also a place of control. Studios controlled every detail of their stars' lives, how they dressed, what they said, even who they appeared with in public. For Hudson, Universal Pictures orchestrated one of the most important cover stories of his life: his marriage to Phyllis Gates, a studio secretary. In 1955, at the height of his fame, Hudson married Gates in a picture-perfect Hollywood romance. The press covered it with enthusiasm, seeing it as proof that America's most eligible bachelor had finally settled down. In reality, the marriage was short-lived and tumultuous. By 1958, it had ended in divorce. To the outside world, it looked like a broken Hollywood love story. But to insiders, it was clear that the marriage was more of a shield than a partnership. Even then, rumors circulated that the wedding was staged, designed to quell gossip about Hudson's sexuality and protect the studio's investment in his image. For Hudson, the arrangement bought time, but it did not ease his deeper conflict. In the secretive circles of Hollywood, Hudson lived a different life. He formed quiet, secret relationships with other men, relationships that had to be conducted quietly, behind closed doors, and always with the fear of being exposed. He attended private gatherings where he could finally relax, laugh, and be himself. Yet even there, he remained cautious, aware that a single misstep could end his career. Close friends later recalled how he was warm and affectionate in private, but reserved and distant in public. always on the lookout for someone who might be eavesdropping. The tension between his true self and the image the world demanded weighed heavily on him. Every time he stepped onto a red carpet with a glamorous actress by his side, he played the part. Every time a magazine declared him the perfect ladies' man, he smiled for the camera but felt pain inside. The performance was convincing, but it came at a cost. Over time, the loneliness of secrecy became its own prison, leaving Hudson both admired by the world and isolated in his own skin. It was here that the shadow of James Dean returned to haunt him. Dean, like Hudson, lived with desires that went beyond the norms of society. However, their approaches to this truth were completely different. Dean, a rebel both on and off screen, never denied the rumors that swirled around him. He leaned into them, letting the rumors fuel his mystique. If people whispered about his sexuality, he shrugged, almost daring them to judge. For him, the scandal was part of the act, another layer of resistance. On the set of Giant in 1956, 3 stars were at the center of one of Hollywood's greatest productions: Elizabeth Taylor, James Dean, and Rock Hudson. To audiences, the trio promised magic. To insiders, it was a storm waiting to break out. What was going on behind the scenes was not camaraderie, but conflict. Conflict that left Hudson with a bitterness that never left him. The tension began with personality and style. James Dean, already a symbol of rebellion, approached acting with raw intensity. He lived his roles, improvised freely, and often challenged directors to capture what he believed to be the truth. Hudson, by contrast, had been shaped by Universal Studios into a glamorous star. He studied his lines, trusted the script, and respected the traditional mechanics of filmmaking. To Dean, this made Hudson seem fake, a puppet of the studio system. He mocked Hudson as a made-up leading man, lacking depth or artistry. Hudson did not take the insult lightly. To him, Dean was reckless, selfish, and immature. He believed that Dean disrespected not only him, but also the craft itself. While Hudson valued professionalism, Dean relished chaos. Their working relationship quickly soured, with Hudson complaining that Dean's unpredictable behavior was disrupting production. To Hudson, Dean was no genius. He was just a nuisance. Elizabeth Taylor, Giant's 3rd star, only complicated things. Young, bright, and full of life, Taylor loved Dean. She admired his talent, laughed at his wild energy, and stuck with him during his long hours on set. Hudson watched their friendship grow with thinly veiled jealousy. Taylor's affection for Dean highlighted everything Hudson lacked: spontaneity, freedom, and a willingness to live without fear of judgment. For a man who had spent his life hiding behind a carefully constructed image, Dean's fearless honesty was infuriating. The animosity between the two men escalated. Later, in private conversations, Hudson admitted that of all the actors he had ever worked with, he hated Dean the most. This was not the usual dislike of colleagues who did not get along. It was vitriolic. He called Dean childish, arrogant, and even a disgrace to his profession. In a shocking confession, Hudson reportedly expressed that he wished Dean were dead. It was a statement born not just of anger, but of something deeper: fear. Because James Dean represented more than an artistic rival. He was a mirror. Both men harbored secrets about their desires, but they expressed them in different ways. Dean accepted the rumors about his sexuality, letting them circulate without denying them. He behaved with a defiant indifference. If the world spoke, so let them speak. Hudson, meanwhile, lived his entire life in fear of exposure. He fought to keep his truth buried, his image untarnished, his career secure. In Dean, he saw the freedom he craved, but never dared to risk. And that freedom made him angry. When tragedy struck in 1955, James Dean died in a car accident at the age of 24. Hollywood mourned. Fans built a legend around the young rebel whose career had ended too soon. Elizabeth Taylor mourned. The world romanticized Dean's short but brilliant life. But Rock Hudson did not join in the admiration. Even after Dean's death, Hudson's contempt remained. He called Dean a thug, a fraud, and a terrible co-worker. And then, nearly 2 decades later, came the most shocking revelation of all. In 1974, Hudson was asked once more about his famous co-star. Without hesitation, he snapped, "I don't mean to say anything bad about the dead man, but he was a bastard." The words stunned those who heard them. It was not just lingering resentment, it was proof that even 20 years later, the hatred still burned, raw and unrepentant. The feud was more than professional jealousy. It was psychological. Hudson's hatred for Dean came from the reflection Dean forced him to see. A man who lived openly in the face of whispers, contrasted with a man who hid every day behind silence. For Hudson, Dean was both rival and tormentor, a reminder of everything he could never be. And that reminder cut deeper than any insult Dean ever spoke aloud. To the world, Rock Hudson was the perfect gentleman, the ideal leading man. But in private, when asked about James Dean, his tone would shift. He never softened, never forgave, never allowed the myth to sway him. He carried his hatred to the end, as if Dean's shadow haunted him long after the cameras stopped rolling. For audiences, Giant remains a masterpiece, a story of love, land, and legacy. But for Rock Hudson, its legacy was something darker. A wound disguised as rivalry, a hatred born not just of clashing egos but of mirrored fears. James Dean was gone, but the battle he represented lived on inside Rock Hudson. A battle between image and truth, between fear and freedom, between the man the world adored and the man who could never fully be himself. By the early 1980s, Rock Hudson's life had shifted far from the glittering spotlight of his golden years. He was still admired, still remembered as one of Hollywood's great leading men, but behind closed doors, he carried a secret that would soon rewrite his legacy. In 1984, Hudson received a devastating diagnosis. He was HIV positive. At a time when AIDS was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized, the news was not just personal, it was explosive. The disease carried with it shame, fear, and silence. Politicians avoided speaking its name, newspapers reported it with prejudice, and Hollywood whispered about it in hushed tones. For Hudson, the diagnosis was more than a death sentence. It was the end of the carefully constructed image he had spent decades maintaining. He had built a career on playing the ideal man, the husband every woman wanted, the gentleman every man envied. Now, his illness threatened to expose the truth he had hidden his entire life. By 1985, the world knew. When Hudson publicly acknowledged his illness, he became the first major Hollywood star to admit to having AIDS. The announcement stunned fans, shocked the press, and forced the American public to confront a crisis it had long tried to ignore. Suddenly, the face of AIDS was not a nameless victim, but Rock Hudson, the ultimate screen idol of the 1950s. In his final months, even as his health rapidly declined, Hudson changed the conversation. His courage to acknowledge the truth brought compassion where there had been judgment, urgency where there had been denial. On October 2, 1985, Rock Hudson died at his home in Beverly Hills. He was only 59 years old. The news rippled across the world. Hollywood mourned the loss of one of its brightest stars. Friends like Elizabeth Taylor stepped forward, channeling grief into activism and helping launch a movement that would transform awareness and funding for AIDS research. For the LGBTQ+ community, Hudson's admission was a turning point, breaking silence in a way no one else could have. Hudson's death did more than mark the end of a life. It reshaped his legacy. To millions, he would always be the tall, handsome gentleman from Pillow Talk or the proud rancher from Giant. But he also became something more. A symbol of both the beauty and the tragedy of concealment. He was proof of how far a man could go in hiding his truth and what it cost him to do so. And yet, in a life defined by secrecy, there was one exception. As friends and biographers later revealed, Hudson could have kept every secret to his grave. He could have buried every whisper, every rumor, every truth about who he was. But there was one thing he never hid: his hatred for James Dean. Rock Hudson could have kept a secret his whole life, but his hatred for James Dean, his greatest rival, his darkest mirror, was a truth he never hid. This confession, repeated over the years, carries as much weight as any of his on-screen roles. To some, condemning a man who died so young seems petty, even cruel. But to Hudson, it is a brutal honesty. Dean was more than a difficult co-star. He was the living embodiment of everything Hudson feared and repressed. Dean's defiance mocked Hudson's caution. Dean's recklessness exposed Hudson's restraint. And for a man who lived behind a mask, the mirror was unbearable. So Rock Hudson died as he lived, admired, desired, and remembered as one of the greats. But his story is not just a story of fame, it is also a story of paradox. He was the manliest of men, yet lived in fear of his own truth. He was a romantic hero, but he died with a heart full of secrets. And while history will honor him as an AIDS pioneer and a Hollywood legend, it will also remember the bitter rivalry that haunted him. Because in the end, there was one truth that Rock Hudson never hid. He could charm the cameras, fool the tabloids, and live a perfect life for decades. But every time the name James Dean appeared, that mask cracked. And in that crack, the real Rock Hudson emerged, not as a perfect idol, but as a man haunted by a hatred that would never let go. Rock Hudson lived a secret life, created by the studios, hidden from the public, and taken to the grave. But his hatred of James Dean was the one truth he never buried. Was it rivalry, jealousy, or the fear of seeing himself in Dean's defiance? Perhaps the answer is as complex as the man himself. One thing is certain: Hollywood legends shine the brightest, but their darkest corners linger the longest. And if you want to continue exploring the dark corners of the silver screen, follow us, like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next untold story.